On today's World Insight, this week's China-U.S. trade deal culminates a year of negotiation. We speak to Chinese scholars about the fine print in this trade armistice.
We should never underestimate the importance of Phase 1 deal.
And here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight on CGTN. Today, let's dive deep into China-U.S. ties in our special program. To ease the ongoing trade war between the two world's largest economies, they are finally preparing to sign a Phase 1 deal this week. What's the significance and impact of the deal, and how to evaluate, in general, the current status and potential of China-U.S. relations? So in our special edition today, we will bring you the insights of some renowned Chinese scholars. Let's begin with Yuan Peng, president of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. He says he's cautiously optimistic about the deal and says, well, it may pause the trade war, it cannot stop the growing competition between China and the U.S. Take a listen. Phase 1, China-U.S. economic and trade negotiations. What's likely to be the time of maneuvering provided by both sides?
I think it's a good news for the pause of U.S.-China trade serious competition. But however, I think even if we have a Phase 1 trade deal, but maybe the next day we're entering into the Phase 2, Phase 3. So this not necessarily means we won't have any more serious competition. For example, the high-tech competition may be even harder. Because recent news suggested that American will have more actions on struggling against Chinese high-tech.
We already understand that since the 6th of this month, January, the exports of AI technologies from the U.S. to China directly has already been banned, quote-unquote, by the U.S. side. So what does that mean to the sentiment here and the discussion of nature of U.S.-China relations from this incident and many others we are seeing day by day?
It's not a pure trade war. At the very beginning, the war means two more substantial aspects. One is the high-tech. The second is the Chinese model, Chinese development model. So it's a go beyond just trade, which means the target of this trade war is not trade per se, but the Chinese development model, which means without achieving this goal, this kind of competition will last long. So recently we see lots of actions on Chinese high-tech, on Huawei, on ZTE, and this struggle will continue. And without achieving the final goal, I doubt that maybe America will take use of every means they can use to hedge against China. For example, Hong Kong issue, Taiwan issue, Xinjiang issue, human rights issue, and Tibetan issues. So many issues still there. So I still have no reason to be optimistic in 2020.
As you may know, some scholars have advised to separate the two kinds of issues. One is more geopolitical, the other is trade and economic issues. However, Professor Yuan, we have also noticed there is a mixture of them from the U.S. side because the latter believe it is to their strategic advantage to do that. So from China's perspective, what to do about this?
Yeah, number one, I think it's very hard to separate political issue and economic issue. And it's very hard because if you read NSC report by Donald Trump administration, if you read different series of speeches by American high-level officials, you can see they have a whole of government China policy, which means they combine all means and resources against the rising of China. So strategically, it's very hard to separate. But for me to see, technically, we still should work hard to separate.
But Professor Yuan, as you may know, over the past year or so, China has been trying to deal with many of the issues you just mentioned, Hong Kong and likely Taiwan and Xinjiang, as well as Tibet, human rights. A lot of these issues, China believes in its own way of doing things, while the rest of the world still need time to catch up in order to understand China's way and also to have sufficient communication about that. So what's likely to be the near potential of these issues? Will they still boiling as you see it? And how much will that have an impact on the ongoing strength showcase between China and the United States?
If you trace U.S.-China relations in a longer history, for example, if you trace the U.S.-China relations in 40 years from the normalization, you can see that all those issues you mentioned always there. Taiwan, Tibet and human rights, arms control sorts of issues always there. But originally, we are fortunate that we have many channels, mechanism between the two countries. So different ministry, different officials can deal with different issues by their own. But today the problems that those issues remain still there, but with lack of channels. So we have only trade negotiation team, which is more visible.
Yeah.
It's very hard to see any other channels.
Do you think there's going to be tremendous danger as a result of this?
Of course, because we are two major powers with so many issues and problems between us. So the experiences in the past 40 years tells us that problems is not so dangerous if we have channels to have a daily based dialogue or weekly based or monthly based. But the danger today is that because no routine works on daily based dialogues, then make those issues maybe out of control. Then this is the origin of the dangers. So my suggestion to the bilateral relations, in particular to American administration, is that we need to resume the dialogues, at least the 4 dialogues which was both agreed in Monterrey, between President Xi and President Trump. Today, the reality is that only the trade and the economic dialogue, the other 3 seems not that active. So we need to resume all those dialogues.
But you understand this is the election year in the U.S., right?
If U.S.-China relations going bad or even going worse, I don't think it's a good news for Donald Trump to win the election. So for him, I still think maintain the peace and stability, even for the consideration of the election, matters. So I think maybe both sides need to revitalize all those dialogues.
I see. Professor Yuan, this is the U.S. election year. With such an unpredictability of the bilateral relations right now, is China ready to handle some of the unprecedented situations?
Because today we are facing the unprecedented changes in 100 years, as President Xi mentioned many times. Because every day there is some breaking news.
Every hour, as we
every
speak
hour.
now.
Yeah, maybe after our interview, maybe something happened. So the worst scenario, preparation is a must for the governments, not only in China, but for elsewhere in the world.
What about for China and the U.S.? What's the worst scenario, do you think?
I think U.S.-China worst scenario is some accidental, conflict militarily, because this is rose the nationalism in both sides. It's very hard to manage.
Now, recently, there's also the U.S. Iranian crisis, apparently. Where do you think it is going? Do you think China and the U.S. will be able to have further opportunities to work on something together as a result of the current unpredictability?
The Iranian nuclear issues. The best way is still that the U.S. and China working together with the European, Russian countries. This maybe provide some new opportunity for U.S. and China to cooperate. Anytime when U.S. and China working together in dealing with other issues beyond the bilateral, then bilateral relations will getting much better. This is a historical experience.
Professor Yang, on the other hand, there seems to be, as some suggest, a competition about setting up the international standard in a way. We see U.S. try to withdraw from various kinds of international mechanisms and treaties, and also creating further escalation of challenges for WTO, for example, with the appellate body. We have also seen the recent practice of assassinating a foreign leader. So, Professor Yang, all of this have invited the international debates, if not criticism, against the United States. So, where is China and where is the United States? Is this going to be an area of competition or an area of cooperation?
We have witnessed almost 70 years of peace and stability in the world after World War II. This is thanks to the cooperation between the 5 countries. But today, it's in the turning point of the old norms and the new norms. In particular, now we're entering a digital era. Something very new needs to be rethought. So it's a good idea for U.S. and China and other countries sitting down together to discuss what's new in today's new world, and what kind of norms need to be remained, what new norms, for example, dealing with the internet or digital, need to be reestablished, what areas need to be reformed. This is the only way to save the world. Otherwise, a world without any international common norms is really dangerous.
The think tank that you're heading, Kicker, is celebrating the 40th anniversary. Now, what kind of responsibility think tanks have in China and elsewhere, particularly in the U.S., about making sure it's not going to be a future of wars, but rather still a future of peace and balance?
So as Chinese think tanks, I think number one, we should, also keep the pace of the time. And secondly, to serve, number one is to serve the Chinese policy-making circle, because the think tanks combined with those thinkers. If thinkers cannot think some good ideas, you cannot blame the government to don't have any good policy. So this is our new mission and a new task. And then I think how to shape the public opinion and mass media rather than kidnapped by public opinion. This is also the mission. And the last but not least is that the international communications. Given the reason that the official dialogues channels didn't work well, and it's more necessary that the think tanks play the track 2, track 1.5 channel to play some kind of role. If that works, maybe even the governmental relations looks not that good, but the people-to-people, military-to-military, think tank-to-think tank still working positively, actively, then generally speaking, the bilateral relations still hopeful.
Professor Yuan Peng, congratulations, 40th anniversary of Kicker.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for taking your time and talking to us.
Thank you.
This is World Insight, a special program about China-U.S. relations. Although there are still many uncertainties in the future, the significance of the Phase 1 trade deal should not be underestimated. If the agreement is signed as planned, will it open the communication channels between China and the U.S. to rise above the current situation? Chen Dongxiao, president of the Shanghai Institute for International Relations, answered my questions.
we should never underestimate the importance of Phase 1 deal.
Explain, please.
Number one, I think that this is the first time ever since the President Trump came to power, and when we talk about a new framework, a new architecture is emerging, governing the U.S.-China relationship. It's kind of a sea change, some people say. Whether we could still sit down in a negotiable way to deal with the differences. And this is the first phase. We try to explore the possibility, and we get it. And number two, I think after almost 20+ months of negotiation, the teams on both sides, they actually breached, I would not say eliminate those misunderstandings. There are still quite a number of misunderstandings, miscalculation. But they have breached the gap, largely narrowed the gap of their perception of their original position, and therefore reached this Phase 1.
Give me some examples, if you can.
For instance, in terms of how to deal with the so-called different systems, economic system of both sides.
Yeah.
Quite a number of the people on American side, at the very first beginning, they said that, okay, since China is so different economically or even politically, so why we not continue to engage with China on this kind of deal? Rather, we'd better to just have separate them into a totally different way, into totally different systems. This is so-called a decoupling or disengagement. I think that impressed me quite vividly that when Lighthizer, in his interview by American media, he said that these two countries, one American system, one Chinese systems, so differently, it will take a long time for us to work out a way to integrate them. He used the word integrate them, which means that even if these two countries are so differently, politically, economically, but still those people working for a more stable relationship try to work out a way to reintegrate these two different systems.
Is this over-interpretation? Many would ask. Whether it's a strategic understanding or just a diplomatic gesture during a process of negotiation.
I would not read his words, but by quoting his words, it seems that at least some of those professionals, those people really in charge of negotiations, they have a more balanced and more sophisticated understanding of these two different systems, and also try to work out a way to deal with it.
If Phase 1 is as important and significant as you just indicated, what do you think would be a great mechanism for the two to work it out?
Big question is whether both sides would implement them in a faithful way. That's a big question.
And faithful way sometimes is also up to interpretation.
Yes.
At different stages of the relationship.
I think that those teams on both sides, they have worked quite professionally way, tried to eliminate those misreading.
Blurred areas.
Yes. So I think that compared with a couple of months ago, those kind of a misunderstanding or this kind of unable to implement it through those misreading will be largely narrowed. But of course, I would not rule out the possibility that maybe there's still some chance. But largely speaking, they have understand the difficulties. But the question is, from those statements from both sides, they have committed themselves to implement those Phase 1 deal. That's a very important and positive message.
The implementation has a lot to do, of course, about the commitment to follow the promises. It also has a lot to do with both countries try to deal with their own challenges through different new ways. For example, changing the policy, for example, upgrading, for example, through innovation, through complying to the international standards, and the list goes on. So how much does that have to do with the internal negotiations within national borders between these two countries when it comes to implementation?
Both sides have formed a very professional team.
Comprehensive
team. And there are quite a big number of inter-agency coordination for those negotiations. And to my best knowledge, at least 30+ different ministries in China have been involved And therefore, those consensus has been reached through those 20-plus negotiations. And this process itself will help mobilize the consensus and mobilize those forces to implement in the future.
What if the other side go on their road further? Would that provide China with any space to still implement the promises of this trade negotiation if strategic relationship is falling to a certain degree?
My understanding is that the process of negotiation itself on trade economic issues in this context of a sea change, political, geostrategically speaking, means that we can still try to work out in a separate way. Economic deal or economic track and the political security and some other track. So I think that this is a good, very good test. Overall, a geopolitical and economic situation is much more complicated. It will impede, it will provide a lot of uncertainties. But I think that this, again, I say that this 20-plus months of negotiation itself have given us a lot of experience and also a certain of confidence that even under this sea change of political, geopolitical uncertainty and context.
One could notice through your words, you're constructive in terms of your attitude about U.S.-China relations. But as you know, from the very beginning, even 40 years ago, there were those coming from both sides trying to suggest that there's going to be strategic competition, ideological competition, or even rivalry. So now, under the current circumstances, do you think you guys are losing ground to them? Do you think you're failing and they are winning?
Sometimes myself and some of my colleagues also label me as a kind of a cautious optimistic, because I myself believe in that we are living in a totally different world today as 40 years ago or even 100 years ago. So if we just use those 100 years ago, all those manuals to continue to guide our bilateral relationship, it will fail. And because we are living in an extremely interconnected, hyperconnected, and increasingly interdependent world. And I think more importantly, we are living in such a vulnerable or fragile international system. There's no other way for either United States, whether it's from the state level, governmental level, or the average people, or from Chinese side, that we can deal with those challenges alone. So that's the reality.
Immediate future, both sides need to have a certain degree of wisdom, probably a degree that they have never tested before. From the Chinese side, Professor Chen, what is that degree of wisdom to you?
I think that sometimes we should keep our strategic patience. Don't get swayed by this a very immediate phenomena or incidents.
Is it still possible when social media is the norm, when everybody is trying to get what's next in the next half minute or next half hour?
This is the challenge. We would say that let's wait until the dust all settle down. But sometimes maybe that's maintained too long time, and it's very difficult for us to see through it. But you see that for the United States, U.S. is in a kind of internal transformation.
To say the least.
Yes, so lots of problems. It's an internal problem, and by United States, those politicians, statesmen, they try to outsource and they try to find scapegoat. We understand that. But there are also an internal debate within the U.S. They also have I would say, the reflection about what is wrong with the United States. So those people who say that the main problem is outside, is China, and those people say that why not we just focus on ourselves? We should wait patiently to some extent to let them settle down, to let those debates go on. But at the same time, when I say that we maintain the strategic patience, it does not mean that we just sit idly. Because today, Chinese side, we have at least 50% of importance in shaping the bilateral trajectories. And as long as we stay on those, what we call a peaceful rise, and work with others, including the United States, on those common challenge, I think that sooner or later, this bilateral relationship will again find a new kind of a rebalance or equilibrium.
As one well-known in China in terms of China-U.S. relations, what would you provide to the policymaker? You already talked about this phrase, strategic patience.
Well, I think that, again, come to those phase one deal. We need to implement it in good faith. And we also need to encourage both sides to implement it in good faith and to give both sides the confidence. And secondly, let's try to, with those spirits of a constructive dialogue, to work on the second phase. And that will at least to give us the confidence and maintain those confidence that both sides can work out a way to try to recouple of these two relationships economically. And then it will again pave the way for a kind of a more broad picture that whether both sides, such different in politically speaking, can work out a balanced, workable way to stay together, live together, and even to grow together.
You're watching World Insight, still to come on our special program today. We continue our in-depth discussions with Chinese scholars to unpack China-U.S. ties.
The first phase means that if it just temporarily stops escalating the conflict.
Back, World Insight special program on China-U.S. relations. I'm Tian Wei. China-U.S. ties are complex in geopolitics as it not only affects the two major countries on opposite sides of the Pacific, it impacts the rest of the globe. Some scholars are more cautious than the others when discussing their dynamic. Yan Xuetong is one of them. He is the Dean of the Institute of Modern International Relations at Tsinghua University. Yan particularly talked about the digital sector between the two countries in our interview earlier.
The competition on the invention of the digital technology will become the core of the China-U.S. rivalry. And U.S. already started the decoupling strategy and try to stop any possible connection with China, which may help China to improve the digital technology. And so for China, from my understanding, also China already and gave the special emphasis on the independent research on the digital technology.
Are we going to see a later realization that maybe standards is still good for everyone? Or are we going to see immediate divisions of standards and also practices?
Even you have only one universal system, it will definitely controlled by the strongest country, the strongest digital country. And that means the U.S. dominated the system, and everyone uses GPS, and then what the U.S. controls everyone. But now people realize, well, it's cheaper, but it's very dangerous. And possibly you are at the risk of being attacked by the U.S. Now, when there's no any country can compete with the U.S., people have to use one universal standard system. But when any country has the capability to develop their own, now, from my understanding, it would do that. So that means, that's why there's a competition between China and the U.S.
Now, after all, China and U.S. economy altogether only 40% of the global GDP.
Yes.
So what about the rest of the 60% choices mean for China and the U.S.?
Well, actually, Chinese market and the American market and so huge, they are equally important to most of the countries in the world. So no country want to and sacrifice any of them. No one wants to lose any of these two big markets. So in that way, they will adopt the hedging strategy. That means taking sides with the two on specific issues with one side on the at the same time. So from my understanding, this kind of strategy, I mean hedging strategy, will become popular among most of the countries, including some major countries. You look at what Japan's current policy toward China. It's so obvious to try to improve the relationship with China and not so firmly stand at the American side.
As you may know, China and the U.S. earlier announced the achievement, as they describe, of the first phase of the trade negotiations. How much opportunity do you think is there?
I think the first phase has a very strong implication for the world. So first phase means that it's just temporarily stop escalating the conflicts. It doesn't mean stop the conflicts. The conflicts will continue, and the conflict will continue to escalate. Just the first phase tell the world that, okay, the escalation may be not that fast, but the escalation will be continue.
Interesting. Always a pleasure talking to you, Professor Yan Shetong. What a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're watching World Insight. Let's continue our discussion about China-U.S. relations. Security always tops the agenda in geopolitics, whether it pertains to the China-U.S. relationship or Northeast Asia. But there are signs, according to some, that Northeast Asia will have more cooperation in the near future. The 20th anniversary of China-Japan-South Korea cooperation has just been celebrated. The leaders' meeting amongst the three countries sought common ground on diplomacy aimed at denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. Xu Hui, a professor at the National Defense University of China and a military and defense expert, explained that despite misconceptions, cooperation, not confrontation, predominates China-U.S. relationship. Let's take a look. So Chinese military and defense experts like you, what is the bottom line that China is willing to deal with when it comes to China-U.S. relations, security-wise?
Okay, sometimes, when people think about China-U.S. relations, they are tending to perceive these relations from the confrontational perspectives, while the intentionally or unintentionally ignore the cooperations. We have a lot of cooperations, but we have to acknowledge that today there is a lot of negative development. But compared with history, I think we still have the confidence that we still have the chance to have a soft landing of these rounds of tensions. And as a military, I think we have to work together to avoid this big ship from sinking to the bottom.
But how could you, well, the other side has already disinvited China, for example, to the latest joint military exercises last year, which happened a year earlier. And meanwhile, you have also seen rhetorics coming from Washington suggest China as the rivalry. And meanwhile, there's sensitive issues like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, human rights, which have been putting pressure on the bilateral relations for quite some time, but this time, once again, escalating that tension. How could, security-wise, you work together? It's very hard, if I understand right.
The issues you mentioned is not something really new.
No, not at all.
Come out,
but not resolved.
Come out again and again, and yes, has not resolved, but it has not, pushed these bilateral relations off track in the past. Maybe in these rounds of, tensions, provoked by the other side, I think maybe they play even bad impact on the relationships. But I think the more challenging and the more provocations the Americans do on us, I think the more damage to their reputation in the global stage.
Things are changing fast, as you may know. The uncertainty is everywhere. What about in Northeast Asia?
When we're talking about Northeast Asia, we should not only focus on the Korean Peninsula. There are bigger pictures.
Yes, there are bigger pictures.
We are coming back, I think, since the turn of the century, up to 2012, and China-Japan-South Korea's cooperation, developed very fast. And we have celebrated the 20 years of trilateral cooperation. I think we have coming back on track.
But, Professor, yes, indeed, there was a trilateral state leader meeting earlier in Chengdu. However, What exactly will be the lasting impact of that is still a question mark. Chinese President Xi Jinping is to visit Japan, but the two countries are still on two different visions. For example, Japan is looking at the United States as security guarantee, but looking at China more with economic engagement. So will this division of labor, quote unquote, be able to transform the earlier relationship? That's a question mark, isn't it?
The most important thing this time for the trilateral meeting in Chengdu, I think, is that both South Korea and Japan take China's rejuvenation as a great opportunity rather than a threat. And they show the willingness, to work together either among the three members or through a kind of joint hands to develop a third party's market and work together. I think that's a very positive development, and we're also looking forward the coming state visit by our President Xi Jinping to Japan. That I believe and I really hope that will be a milestone visit for the further reconciliation and cooperation for the true prosperity and peace in this East Asia.
But territorial issues still exist between China and Japan.
We have the wisdom, We lived with that for half a century now. With the concept of sharing disputes, we properly, deal with that issue and avoid these small issues, prevent, bigger cooperations among the members. And all we notice, we benefit from that.
All right. What about South China Sea? Since you also talk about the Northeast Asia, of course, the China-ASEAN relationship has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, South China Sea, it's a challenge to China's relation with some ASEAN members. But also, I think, provide opportunity for us to know each other. And the positive development is that ASEAN as a whole, they understand China's good willingness for a peaceful settlement with the negotiations on COC and with the strengthening of bilateral trade, social, cultural relationships. And also those different claimants of disputes of the territory, after several rounds of tests or kind of tensions, crises or semi-crisis, we say, they finally find out also they understand China's good intention for a peaceful settlement.
Yeah.
So while somebody try to force them to choosing side, either on the side of China or so-called on China side of America, I think neither side they choose. Most of the members, they choose the side of peace and development, rather than stand by with somebody to confront with others. But I think that shows to us the wisdom of the ASEAN members, also the Eastern culture.
One of the things you've been doing, General Xu, is to incorporate the young generals and military personnel from all over the world and get them trained here in China to work with the Chinese side as well. I was at earlier some of your events. It was very impressive coming from 60 and 70 countries, military personnel coming together under one roof, discuss about world peace. Now, General Xu, to what extent China will make the effort to bring all of these different minds and voices together at a time when the apparent leadership of the United States has been rather retreating than succeeding?
Our purpose is to invite them coming here to take advantage of international platform. On one hand, let them have an understanding of real picture of China. Seeing is believing. But the biggest advantage and superiority of our college is that the international exchange. Because we invited all countries who have diplomatic relations with us coming to our college. We have almost 180 countries send their senior officer either for career development training, preparing for future generalship, or for short-term exchange, include the superpower United States of America senior officers. We encourage them to have an open mind and respect the principle of non-attribution policy, to share with each other, to learn to know the other's perspectives. So to reduce misperception and misunderstanding, and find ways to share experience, find ways for a peaceful settlement of the world disputes. I think different countries' officers coming will take whatever they need. And China is the largest developing country, so in their understandings, our solution and concept may more or less helpful to resolve their own problems.
General Xu, finally, before we go, we've seen a lot of changes going on right now. The issue is unpredictability. Now, the military and the security aspect of a country needs is the time and the energy and the clear strategic thinking to develop. At a time of big uncertainties, how will these issues be figured out? How much confidence do you have about China's process of doing it and its possible results?
I think my answer or solution is that communication, dialogue, rather than simply blaming each other, or even have tensions. From this point of view, I do hope someday in our college or either in the American National Defense University, we can hold a kind of bilateral senior officer or general's policy dialogue. We need to talk with each other face to face, even though we are living in a digital world. But the face to face, eye to eye, look at each other's dialogue like us is irreplaceable. And I'm sure if we sit together, finally we can find out we are not necessarily to confront with each other. We have bigger room to work together for the common goods for both sides and the world.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight, CGTN, into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insight across China and around the world. Good night.